Well, welcome everybody. Thanks to everybody for joining us today for this episode of the STR Division's Meet the Scholar series. My name is Rich McAdock, and I'll be your host for today while I interview our distinguished scholar, my very old friend, Russ Koff, whom I met way back in 1997 at the Academy of Management in San Diego. We've known each other a long time. We've co-authored, we've worked together, we've been colleagues, and it's really a great honor and privilege to have the opportunity to interview Russ today. So welcome everybody. So let me go ahead and introduce Russ. And by the way, oh, sorry, one other thing, I just did want to say thank you to the STR team, to Tim, Zhao, Samina, and Gwen, and anybody and everybody else involved that I'm forgetting for organizing the Meet the Scholar series, which has been a great benefit to the entire field, and for helping to put together today's session in particular. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you, and let me introduce our guest, Russ Koff. I hope that everybody can see the screen that I'm sharing. I see a nod or two, so I'm going to take that as a yes. So Russ serves as the Thomas Falk Distinguished Chair in Business and former Senior Associate Dean and Acting Dean at University of Wisconsin. He was previously at Emory University, where I recruited him in, I guess it was what, 1998 or something like that, or 97. And before that was at Washington University in St. Louis for a few years. He earned his doctorate at UCLA in 1993. His research focuses mainly on strategic human capital, including investments in knowledge-based assets, capturing value from human capital-based competitive advantage, innovation under asymmetric information and uncertainty, and challenges of human capital-intensive mergers and acquisitions. He has published 15 articles in top-tier journals, has over 8,400 Google Scholar citations, has won 2 of the field's most prestigious awards, the 2009 AMR Best Paper Award, and the 2007.
You'd want to emphasize that one.
Yeah, well, actually, I want to emphasize both of these because I'm a co-winner on both of these awards. The 2009 AMR Best Paper Award and the 2007 STR division, I guess back then it was the BPS division, Glick Best Paper Award. Those were both for the same paper.
Authored with Rich.
Got to put in a plug. Hey, I got to get something out of putting in my effort for showing up today. Huh? So read that paper. It's a good paper. At least other people think so, who gave out these awards. He is a fellow, past president, and board member of SMS. He chaired the AOM STR division and also the SMS's Strategic Human Capital Interest Group. He was thankfully a great co-organizer with me of the Atlanta Competitive Advantage Conference, or as we called it, ACAC. And he has served on numerous editorial boards, including SMJ, AMR, AMJ, and Org Science. Thank you, Gwen, for putting the citation to our paper in the chat window. Appreciate that. He served as co-editor of Strategic Organization and guest editor for the Strategic Human Capital special issue of Journal of Management. He has chaired 6 dissertation committees, and he currently runs the Carpenter Strategy Toolbox blog, which includes over 300 strategy teaching techniques. So please join me in welcoming Russ Koff.
Thank you, Rich. I am honored. I thought you were going to roast me a lot worse than that, but I appreciate it. Those of you who came for the train wreck, well, I don't know, maybe there's more to come. We'll see.
Hey, yeah, I haven't asked a question yet, man.
That's right.
So, I love to start these interviews out by asking about, the path into this strange career that we call strategy professor. You may not have been the 10-year-old who said, I really want to be a strategy professor when I grow up, but compared to most of us, your pathway from the work that you were doing before academia to the work that you're doing now was more direct and straightforward than most of us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I wasn't feeling that, actually. It didn't feel, didn't feel remotely straightforward. So I had no idea that academia was going to be a thing for me. In fact, the year before I applied to the PhD program, I applied to the MBA program and the evening MBA program and was rejected. So that tells you I really had no idea that research was going to be my career. But I was working in a consulting firm doing litigation economics. We were measuring the value of human assets acquired in mergers and acquisitions. Specifically for tax purposes, the buyer wanted to separate it from goodwill that was created by the transaction so that they could write it off more quickly. At the time, you could write off goodwill over 50 years, and they wanted an accelerated amortization schedule to write off, when you're buying a service company, a huge portion of the value of the transaction exceeds the purchase price. And that just becomes goodwill. So in essence, as a consultant, I was engaged in the depreciation of people. I know you think you're supposed to be appreciating people, but I was involved in depreciating them. And it occurred to me then that, our accounting system was set up just to, it was distorting the reality. All expenditures associated with people are treated as expenses. And by definition, in accounting terms, an expense is something that has no value beyond the current accounting period.
Right.
And so it just wasn't possible, and still isn't possible, frankly, in accounting terms, to treat people as assets. And so, the next year I did apply to the PhD program, and but I applied in the human resource management area, kind of looking at, I didn't actually, at UCLA, what might be thought of as a management department was split into 4 separate departments, where sometimes if the faculty passed each other in the hall, they wouldn't say hi to each other. So it was very separated, and I ended up in the wrong, in effect, in the long run, the wrong department for me. I thought I was strategic HR, but when I started talking about mergers and acquisitions and bid premia and medium of exchange and stuff like that to HR people, they were like, and why is that HR?
Right.
And I was just kind of fortunate that I realized that where the strategy field was moving, there was an opportunity to recast my work in that area. I was lucky, but I was also clueless.
Well, I mean, it was so you poo-pooed my point about there being a kind of a straight line direct connection, but you were valuing human resources. You were valuing strategic human capital, right? In your previous job. That was your job, was to put a value on strategic human capital.
That was my job. And that, by the way, illustrates that it is a very practical problem. This is an applied problem. This is something managers have to deal with. Yeah.
So did you, so I'm going to guess that you came into the PhD program with your dissertation topic in mind. Is that right?
I had some idea, but no, I didn't really have the topic. And if I had the topic, it would not have taken me 7 years to complete the program.
Well, okay.
Anyway, 7 years at UCLA was the average, and I was average in every way.
So, okay, so tell us the story about how you came onto this topic. How did you find this dissertation topic that you did? First of all, maybe remind us what the dissertation topic was, what the research question was, and then tell us how you found it.
So I was interested in, given So there's an accounting side of it, and as a consultant, that's what I was focused on, the valuation of the human assets in M&A. So, one could have explored this in accounting, and in fact, my advisor had a dual appointment in the accounting department at UCLA. I was more interested in the fact that buyers don't have this information than I was in how to provide this information to them. And so, I came to that. I didn't know that that's what I was going to do, but I came to that gradually saying, well, what's the right question to ask here? And it seemed like the question was, wow, this is really hard information to gather. My consulting projects were in the context of brokerage firms. And in the context of brokerage firms, every broker is a profit center. You can trace the revenue right to the broker, and with reasonable accuracy. Not only that, that if the broker leaves, the client may follow the broker. We now have work, Deepak, Samaya, and others have looked at, people following, clients following professionals. That was clearly a factor. And that's actually how we separated the value of the human asset from goodwill. So is looking at whether clients would follow the brokers. Well, in most cases, you don't have that directed revenue trail to specific individuals. And so the story in most acquisitions really is we don't have this information more than we have this information. How can we just calculate it?
Right. And in the case of the brokerage firms, there was minimal spillover across people in terms of the value that they brought, right? That was pretty.
That's right. It wasn't really team production. I mean, that isn't to say there wasn't, a back office that was important.
True.
But it really was not for the brokers. Relationships.
Right. Yeah. For the brokers, it was pooled interdependence, as Thompson would have said.
Yeah. That's right.
So,
so it actually took me a while, and it was really hard to find the data. I mean, these days, I worked with what is, in essence, the early version of the SDC M&A database. And they weren't used to working with academics. And when they saw my data request, they said, well, that'll be $20,000. And $20,000 back then actually meant something. There was just no way.
So how did you overcome that obstacle?
I pared down what my data request was. So it's, by today's standards, it was a small data set, ultimately.
Right. So, okay, so you found this this dissertation topic. So it sounds like the biggest challenge in finding the dissertation topic was framing, right? You knew that there was this issue that there's this information asymmetry between the buyers and the sellers in the M&A about the value of strategic human capital in the firm. And so the question was, what's the question was, what's the question about that? What was the question to ask about that? And you said, well, what's not so much how do we fix that problem for the buyers, but what's the consequences of that problem for the buyers and for the sellers, right? So, so what other than the expense of $20,000 for price tag for data, what other challenges did you face in the dissertation project?
Well, like everybody, there was a lot of manual coding. The database has information on advisors. Some of my hypotheses had to do with the number and nature of the advisors employed to deal with the asymmetric information. So I used human capital largely as a proxy for asymmetric information in the transaction. And so there's plenty of theory about asymmetric information that I could borrow and bring into that context. And advisors, the data still are not very good on advisors in M&A transactions, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So, challenges were sort of bringing it in, combining databases, usual stuff, I guess.
Okay.
So,
so tell us a little bit about the transition that you've made from the work that you were doing then to what you're doing now. What pivots have taken place along the way? What changes have you made? What new interests have you developed? What old interests have you dropped? Tell us a little bit about your pathway from dissertation Russ to 2021 Russ.
Where to begin? I guess I would frame it as it was a process of unlearning. There's a lot of assumptions in the literature, in theory, that over time that I was making, that over time I have realized these are not realistic assumptions. In fact, they're radically unrealistic assumptions. And so then the question is, well, if these are unrealistic assumptions, then you know, how does the world actually work? You know, in some sense, what we want to understand is how the world works. And our theory, you know, I recognize theory is by definition an abstraction from reality. It needs to be parsimonious, but then it needs to identify the most critical factors, and it should have predictive validity at some point. And at some point, I realized that some of the things we were relying on the most, like firm specificity, were absolutely not the way the world was working. And I was, like everybody else, I was, you know, relying on that theory. So for me, it's been a journey to unlearn things that I think I took for granted early on.
Right. And I think you've told me and others the story about when you first started teaching strategy, that there was some unlearning involved there, or at least some revelation involved there that may have led you to pursue the kind of early theory papers that you developed, your AMR paper and your, what was the other one?
So,
yeah.
So I guess, you know, for people looking for research ideas, let me say that they are kind of all around you, and you have to recognize a research idea when it bites you on the nose, and be open to it, because it might not be the way you were thinking about the world. So my very first paper, as a young scholar, I was teaching the resource-based view, and I ended a class of undergraduates. I ended a class with a sentence that read something like, so in conclusion, to gain a competitive advantage, firms should invest in resources that are causally ambiguous, firm-specific, and socially complex, which is, you know, pretty much drawn from the resource-based view. And my undergraduates wrote that crap down. But I walked away saying, oh my God, how can you can't tell a manager to invest in resources that are causally ambiguous? They just laugh at you. There's just no way invest in resources that I cannot link to performance. Absolutely not. There is just no way. And so it became clear that there was not just a small hole, but like a major hole in our thinking about what are the practical implications of our theory, because you really had to solve a host of problems. How do you acquire resources that are like that? How do you integrate them? How do you manage them when there are tremendous information asymmetry problems? And human capital was a special case where you couldn't own the resource. Therefore, there were property rights kinds of issues, control kinds of issues. If that was going to be a source of competitive advantage, you really had to address just a host of problems that we didn't really have theory kind of focused around. So I was teaching, and you know, there it was. I said something that I couldn't defend, that I you know, and so just pay attention when you're teaching, forces you to recognize where the holes are in what we do.
I love that story. I love that story. And you know, one of the things that I love about it is it highlights the tension in the theory between imitation and appropriation, right? That the things that help a firm in terms of imitability or non-imitability also hurt it in terms of appropriation. And that's most clear with human capital, but I don't think it's unique to human capital. I think there's other ways that plays out as well. And so, you know, I think your point is well taken, that at that point, the field was way, you know, in terms of the balance between imitation and appropriation, it was way out of balance, right? The field was way over-focused on imitation and way under-focused on appropriation. And those are competing threats, and there's a trade-off there. And I think that's a wonderful service that you did for the field to highlight that trade-off. I'm not sure if there's a question there, but if you have a response, let me know.
Well, obviously I focused a lot on appropriation. And again, if you're acknowledging that human assets might be a significant source of competitive advantage, then it really pushes you to recognize that they may be that people may be in a position to appropriate value. So it really pushed that question of who appropriates value. And I want to take it a step further, because we as strategy scholars take for granted that we understand certain terms and we use them loosely all the time.
Yeah.
And so this pushed me to some of the terms that I don't think we understand. Here's one: firm. What is a firm? And human capital really pushes that. I mean, maybe to the extreme, because most strategy scholars would look at value that's appropriated by employees as value that's not appropriated by the firm. But if that's true, then who is allowed to appropriate the value? Because firms don't appropriate value. It all is going to go to some individual. So if it's not going to go to employees, and you're not going to sort of acknowledge that in that case employees are in fact part of the firm, then you're really probably going to be saying, well, it's actually shareholders then. But in these days, most people will not align. Most people don't align formally with sort of shareholder primacy arguments, but then they're not aware that this appropriation, issue, that they're taking the position of shareholder primacy, even in that context. It's how these things are connected maybe is not everybody is thinking about it. But in fact, what we are doing is treating employees as external suppliers. So in the five forces model, they're not part of the firm. They're actually these external suppliers, which if the firm was going out on the spot market, hiring new workers on the street every single day, then that actually would be the case. I would buy that. But when we're talking about internal labor markets, we should be acknowledging, what stakeholders. I mean, that's, micro foundations 101. Who is it that is a stakeholder of the firm that is actually part of the firm? And I don't think we've sort of addressed that fully.
Right. I mean, you're right. There are a lot of terms that we use very loosely, that we don't define.
Like competitive advantage.
Competitive advantage is a great.
You're going to come to that eventually.
Competitive advantage is a great one. And I know a lot of interesting work is being done now on trying to nail down a better definition of competitive advantage, including by some of the people here on this call. So, but there's that also reminds me, when you said we use these terms loosely without maybe even thinking about what they mean, and you talked about human capital, I thought, gee, I wonder if human is one of those terms, because these days, we used to draw this distinction between tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge and codified knowledge and that sort of thing. But these days, human knowledge through machine learning can be captured without being codified, right? We have these models that can do what people can do without knowing how they're doing it, So I don't know, perhaps a research idea for someone out there.
So it's funny that you should mention that, actually. My brother's on this call, and he's also a co-author.
Oh yeah, hi David.
And and we have an AMR together because he was selling to a customer. He worked at AT&T. He was selling a technology to a customer that allowed their knowledge workers to extend their knowledge electronically without codifying it. And he told me about this customer, and I was like, in our knowledge literature, it's all focused on you have to codify the knowledge in order to scale it up, in order to transfer it. And we have this codification problem that if we codify it, then it's available and can be imitated. So, that's a really important question in our literature. And here, from his standpoint, it was a very practical problem. He was providing the service to his customer on how to extend the knowledge, and actually the solution created more codified knowledge or more tacit knowledge than existed before the technology was applied. So, there it was, just contradicting our literature, and, you just have to recognize when these things bite you.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's been a consistent theme of yours in your work, is just looking for.
I'm lucky that I have been bitten a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, I used to think of Russ's work as being kind of the dark side of X, fill in the blank for X. But actually, it's more like, the surprises that we encounter that call BS. I was going to say something different there. That call BS on our theory. Yeah.
A little bit.
Where the real world calls BS on it. So I noticed that we do have one question in the chat window from Sushant, and it reminds me of that. So Sushant is asking, since it took you some time to find your dissertation topic, can you also talk a bit about the role of your advisor in that process? Now, I know, of course, that from our earlier conversations that you had a little bit of a challenge in assembling a dissertation committee and a set of advisors. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about this issue of the role of advisors and committee members in the development of your dissertation ideas.
I'll try not to throw anybody under the bus. I didn't realize that I was a strategy scholar, so I created a dissertation committee that was in the HR Industrial Relations Department at UCLA, which was largely labor econ. So there was a separate department for organizational behavior separate from HR Industrial Relations. So this really was labor economists. And I had somebody from the law school who did M&A. I had Lynn Zucker in the sociology department. I had nobody from the strategy department at UCLA because I didn't know that's where I was. And I went to, at one point, I went to Bill Ochi, who was the director of the PhD program. And I said, hey, you've expressed some interest in the project I'm working on. I'm realizing that I'm a bit more of a strategy scholar than an HR scholar, or at least I'm bridging. Would you be interested in being on my committee? And he looked at who else was on my committee and said, well, it seems to me that you have enough personalities on your committee. You don't need me. So I went without that. Then I did go on the job market. I failed on the job market as an HR person. I mean, completely failed. And the next year I went out on the job market as a strategy person, but not from the strategy department, which is awkward. They didn't all know me. And so I will tell all of my embarrassing stories because I can laugh at them now. At the time, it wasn't hilarious. I sent a memo around to all of the strategy faculty saying, here's who I am. This is what I do. This is why it fits with strategy. I'm not asking for your recommendation, but I'm hoping that if you have a colleague that calls you from another school and asks you about me, that you won't say, we don't have a student by that name. And Marvin Lieberman still, he sees me and he busts up because that's the funniest thing he's ever seen. Tells you a lot about people's senses of humor there. But I was lost. I can't emphasize that enough. I was very lost.
Yeah, I can understand that, yeah. Figuring out where the tribe that you belong to, is a big challenge for people in the early stages. Yeah. And, to Bill Uchi's point about, why he declined to sit on your committee, I think there is some wisdom there. I had a classmate who was 1 year ahead of me in the PhD program. He gave me this one piece of advice on forming a dissertation committee. He said, when two dogs fight over a bone, the bone loses. So, yeah. I
have no doubt that he did me a big favor.
Yeah. You might still be working on that dissertation now.
I might. I might. The end of the statistical tail. So I told you I was completely average. The end of the statistical tail was 13 years.
Ouch. Whew. And that person finished?
Yes, he did. And he must have had he was a Remelt student. He must have had 7, 8 different dissertation ideas. He just, never, dissertations are like roller coasters, right? You always have those low points. And the question is whether you keep your idea or whether you jump to the next car. And he kept jumping.
See, now it's interesting because Tim, I know, is on the call, and he just recently posted a video on the STR channel about precisely that topic, one of the STR Nuggets series, about this question of do you jump ship, or do you hang tight? And I think he's got some really good advice in that video. So anybody for whom that point resonates, if you're on this call or watching this video, if that point resonates with you, go ahead and watch Tim's STR Nugget video. It's really good. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about what your areas of research are. Oh, and I see, thank you, Zhao, putting the link to that video in the chat window, and thanks to Gwen for putting the references to all of Russ's papers in the chat window. I'll do this question from Allie. Allie is asking, what do you say to students today with regard to the whole VRIO framework instead of what you were saying back when you first started teaching undergraduate strategy and found yourself not believing what you were saying? So what do you say instead?
I'm more prone to talk about what are the management challenges that you have to face in order to both acquire and manage resources that fit these sort of profiles that we think are so important. And I think, the strategic factor market literature has expanded on that. There's an understanding in that literature, I think a nice understanding that there are likely to be information asymmetries, and it might be hard to find, if you will, kind of a bargain in that literature. And of course, your work fits nicely in looking at that. I think we still have a ways to go to understand sort of the management challenges associated with creating value with the kinds of resources that we say are hard to imitate. I think that's a challenge that there's more to do in that area. And, I do my best to acknowledge that, yeah, there's going to be some challenges. It does highlight some of the HR challenges that exist anyway in the HR literature. How do you identify top performers is, it's a fundamental problem that already exists, except that they might not have linked that problem to the kinds of resources that are associated with the resource-based view. So something that is a fundamental problem in the literature, but not necessarily acknowledged as being a strategic problem, I would say it is in fact a strategic problem.
Good point. Yeah, because these questions do spill across fields, obviously. So you kind of anticipated the next question that I was going to ask in your answer to that last question, because you said that more work needed to be done on how to create and capture value from resources that are difficult to imitate. So the question I was going to ask is, within your field of expertise, within the topic area that you study, which is strategic human capital, and human capital intensive M&A, information asymmetry and uncertainties effect on innovation. What do you think are the most important unanswered questions in that topic area? What do we not know about those topics that we really should know by now?
So I see that Zhao put my paper with Ben and DK. We refer to ourselves as the Oreo team, but I'll leave that aside, how that came about. I think, working with them began sort of a journey where I was looking hard at some of the things that we took for granted, like the role of firm specificity in value creation and value capture. There was sort of an assumption of what that was, drawn from kind of neoclassical Becker-esque theory. And what we started to realize is over time is that, well, firm specificity doesn't actually work that way in actual markets. At least rarely it does. I mean, there have to be boundary conditions on this, that it's very hard to observe firm specificity. And the notion that labor markets price it appropriately, which is embedded in that theory, really didn't make sense. So we were assuming, our field was assuming a level of market efficiency in labor markets that we would not, because we're all about sort of market failures. So we would not have assumed that level of market efficiency in other kinds of markets. So why would we think labor markets are that efficient that they would price what might be tacit knowledge appropriately? And that, and on the top of that, because I in my standard sort of process is to look at how are practitioners looking at these problems. And I got to tell you, HR professionals, they do not recognize firm specificity as a hazard. Mm-hmm. Somebody that's long tenured is somebody that has a stable employment history. They want people like that. And it'll take you a while to explain firm specificity to HR people, because it's not a problem they worry about.
But in all fairness, it's not their job to worry about, right?
Well, it is their job to pay people and get a marginal productivity that meets or exceeds what they're paying them. And if the theory was right that people in fact are who have firm specific knowledge and firm specific skills are less productive at other firms, mm-hmm. then that would be really relevant for them. They don't think that way for the most part. And I think they're right. On the whole, I think they're right. And partly because there's so much noise in trying to measure firm specificity that you would be introducing a whole lot of noise into your decision, and it could make your decision worse. So, you asked me, what do I think, needs to happen going forward? Well, that journey brought me to this question of, what we thought was true doesn't seem to be how the world works in terms of, what I still would acknowledge, by the way, that firm specificity is important for firms that have to have idiosyncratic capabilities. For a unique capability to exist in one firm, there must be knowledge that's unique to that firm. It's just that I don't think that the labor markets work that way, pricing it that way, that the theory was kind of assuming. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that what we thought was the case, the link between human capital and competitive advantage, is probably not what the initial theory said it was. The Oreo team, we tried to untangle that a bit. I would not say that we succeeded. I mean, I think we took a first step in that area, but I think the conclusion that I would come to is, we tore down what was kind of a straw man theory that existed in the literature. So what do we replace it with? And we tried, but I actually think that there is a lot of work to do to sort of figure out, well, if we think human capital is critical for competitive advantage, the straw man theory doesn't work. We have a lot of building to do.
Good point. Good point. I have kind of a related, but perhaps a tangential question. So your work was, I think, some of the first work in the field of strategy to deal with this topic of strategic human capital. Was it the first work? Was there anybody else doing research on strategic human capital before you came along?
So yeah, sure, of course. I mean, there were, I would say there was strategic HR was certainly an area.
Right.
And that's what I thought I was at the time. But I guess what I would say is what I discovered when I went on the job market is that strategic HR was defined as stuff that goes on in an HR department,
right,
to support a strategy that comes exogenously from above.
Right.
So in some
that's
sense,
an HR topic rather than a strategy topic.
Yeah. So in some sense, it said anything that's interesting, we don't do it. From my standpoint, anyway.
But within the strategy literature,
yeah, I don't think it's that way now. Just to be clear. I mean, yeah, there were people in the strategy literature certainly before me, that were acknowledging that human capital was an important source of competitive advantage. In fact,
yeah,
that was quite central, I think, in the emergence of the resource-based view, is to acknowledge that the kinds of assets that the resource-based view was focused on were bound to involve people. So absolutely, there was work.
You're right, and I'm embarrassing myself because I'm forgetting Connie's paper. Castanis.
Connie had a paper in
right.
Yeah, 92, I think, 91, 92.
Apologies for forgetting that.
Before that, even Hall had a paper looking at types of sort of a typology of human capital. I think if I were to say what did I do that was different, is coming back to that dark side that you mentioned earlier, is to say, well, you're not going to have a competitive advantage from human capital unless you sort of address these kinds of fundamental problems associated with it.
Right. So the question I was going to ask then is, okay, so you weren't the very first person to study strategic human capital within the strategy field, but you were definitely a pioneer, one of the very first pioneers. What are the challenges that you faced as a pioneer of a brand new subfield? What kind of challenges did you have to overcome, and how did you overcome those?
So that kind of gets at Samina's question too, in the chat. I think so. A key question is, who is your audience, right? I have borrowed from Jay the ABC approach to writing introductions. Many of you have heard me talk about that. I see David Krasinski is like falling off his chair because he's heard it so many times. But the first question is, who is your audience? And if there aren't a lot of people doing human capital work in the strategy field, who is your audience? And it turns out that my first publication, at AMR, it was taken by a strategic HR editor, who then sent it to three reviewers who were from the strategic HR field. And I was using terms that were fundamentally strategy oriented to identify the problems associated with human capital. And so I was talking about things like moral hazard and adverse selection, which are economic terms for these. Probably most of you are pretty familiar with those terms, that would be associated with information asymmetries in labor markets and within firms, those kinds of things. And I had to, with the reviewers, build a translation table, because the language was sort of a barrier to talking to them. They were interested in the topic, but moral hazard problems became a discussion of motivation. And it's interesting because there's an attribution there. So when you use the term moral hazard, you're basically saying the agent is misbehaving.
Mm-hmm.
When you use the term motivation problem, which is more associated with the HR literature, you're basically saying the principal put in place a really stupid incentive system. And there's a blame game there. Whose fault is it? We have an agent who's misbehaving, or we have a principal who didn't know what they're doing, but our behavioral assumptions are the same. And so with the reviewers, I kind of had to build, that kind of language bridge. So my early audience ended up being on the HR side, I think, at least for that. But that surprised me, because I certainly didn't write the paper initially for HR people, not with that language. Right.
So finding the audience and and translating the ideas for that audience, and then but those those reviewers from strategic HR perhaps were not the ultimate audience for your work, right? Because your work was more ultimately aimed for the strategy field.
So there is an audience there, but yeah, I mean, I was aiming for the strategy field, and I ended up, getting some HR folks, I hope HR folks interested in this, in some of the questions. Part of what I wanted HR people to realize is some things that they don't think of as strategic are in fact very strategic.
So you want to elaborate on that? Like what things?
Well, like these motivation problems. Well, motivation is a fundamental issue in the OB and HR literature. Incentives are a fundamental issue in those literatures, but they might not, the strategic HR literature was not focused on that problem. That was considered sort of an operational problem. But once we take into account the kind of assets that strategy is focused on, well, it's a whole lot more strategic.
Right. Okay. So you had to translate your strategy thinking for that audience in strategic HR. But how did you get traction for your work within the strategy field? Was there any
is there traction?
Special challenge? I would say 8,000 citations is traction.
It grew over time. I think what happened is there were other scholars that were interested in these kinds of questions, and to an extent they were a little bit lost, not quite as lost as me, but a little bit lost. I want to say, so you mentioned the Strategic Human Capital Interest Group at
right.
SMS. I got to give some credit to Jay. Jay tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I think we need a home for strategic human capital. Would you do this and help us get started?" And we made a concerted effort to sort of reach out to HR people. It was somewhat successful, not as successful as I might have hoped, but we got some great people in that way, and it highlighted it also for strategy people who were interested in those questions.
Yeah, and I think you deserve a lot of credit for stepping up and taking responsibility for that whole initiative, and the strategic HR interest group in SMS is, I think, one of the most active and vibrant interest groups in SMS. They've got a great website. I'll just put a plug in for their website that has a wonderful review of the strategic human capital literatures on various different topics. I've often recommended that website and its literature review to doctoral students who are interested in that topic.
You know what I think they've done really well is mentoring junior scholars. Has kind of they have kind of deep mentoring, like year-long mentoring groups that are just awesome. I think we need more of that, especially as we're sort of isolated, which obviously we hope that ends soon, but
yes. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's good lessons here in terms of, if you're pioneering a new research topic, you have to be willing to put in some effort to do some institution building. And I think that's been a great contribution that you've made to the field. So why don't we take a pause here and give Zhao her chance to take her group photo that she needs for spreading the word on Twitter and other social media platforms.
Great. So everyone, if you could just turn on your camera for a second and show us your beautiful smile. I'll call 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Got it. Thank you.
Okay,
back to you, Rich.
Great. Thank you all for participating in that. Okay. So let me see. I've got a couple more questions I could go to. Zhao, give me some idea of how much time I've got left. And where are
we have 38 minutes until the end of the session.
38 minutes. Okay, sure. So let me maybe just ask one more question before I kind of throw it open to the assembled hordes here. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Russ, you have mentored numerous doctoral students, and I think including being, I think I said, I don't remember, it's like 6 or something that you were primary advisor to. What's the most important piece of advice that you give to your own doctoral students?
I think probably the most important piece of advice, which I draw from the resource-based view, is to leverage your own unique background, your unique experience to find problems. So in some sense, most, if not all of my problems have been found because I've looked around me, I've had prior experience. You kind of have highlighted those aspects of the story. When I meet with doctoral students, even when they apply to our program, I want to hear about their work experience. I want to hear what is unique. So I have a student who finished last year. Buki is now at UT Austin. She's an architect, a licensed architect, and so I encouraged her to explore that. Well, physical space is not something that strategy scholars have explored all that much, but it seems obvious that it's a complementary asset to human capital. Their productivity and teams' productivity can vary widely depending on the physical layout of an organization. And it's not an area that has zero research around it. It has research, just not really mostly amongst strategy scholars. And she had this unique expertise and the lens. And I guess what I would say is, from a resource-based standpoint, your unique perspective is what you bring to the literature when you read a paper that helps you see something that the previous person who read the same article didn't see. You see an opportunity that somebody else didn't see. So understanding what's unique about your own lens, I think, is a starting point to identifying interesting problems.
And so it's clear that you preach what you practice.
I try.
Good. So I see we have at least one unanswered question in the chat. Why don't I let Jasmine ask her question?
Oh, cool. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all the information that both of you have given us so far. I think it's so cool to hear from people who have, I went for a BA in economics, and both of y'all have a BA in economics, for example, Dr. Coff in psychology, and then Dr. McAdock, you're coming from economics and mathematics backgrounds. That's just so cool to be able to talk to people who have expanded and done so well in this area of strategic management. But I guess stemming from this, being a young person in academia, I just see this changing world around me, and it's looking really interesting and sometimes scary, right? So I was wondering, how do you think that human capital strategies in higher education specifically might be impacted by these recent events and phenomena? And do you think that these changes could be beneficial or harmful for the future of academics, maybe hopefully myself one day?
Well, we're in an interesting world right now, Jasmine, and I think there's so many moving parts to the question, in some sense, because the change that's hitting us is hitting us from so many different angles, right? I think some of it represents opportunities for us. So, if you haven't noticed already, there will be a wave of people using COVID as an identification strategy, coming forward, and it will be a pretty effective one in many cases. So, people see those opportunities. It has highlighted the role of diversity, which, as strategy scholars, we need to take diversity seriously and recognize that we tend to be focused on diversity in the form of diverse expertise. I, as a human capital scholar, am focused on mostly diverse expertise. But the world that we live in requires us to look at diversity much more broadly and acknowledge, how does that play out in organizations? If you have an R&D team that is diverse in the racial or gender sense. What is the implication of that for research productivity? And I think we see some exploration of that, but in this world, I think it's especially critical. So there's opportunities, I think. So there's challenges too, I think. I love to see how STR has responded, SMS as well, but Samina is here, and Samina has done some amazing stuff, and the rest of the STR team has done some amazing stuff. I'm really excited about what's been happening at STR to support people, to sort of help people, bring people forward. CCC has taken steps to help scholars. I hope that sticks. The notion that we should help each other is maybe that can change the culture of the field a little bit. And I hope it does. So that's where I'm at with that, I think. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but you got me to ramble, so nice job.
As if that's hard. So I see David DK. I'm still not used to calling him DK. I've always called him David, but I see that DK has put some comments in the chat window. The chat window will be lost to history, so I wanted to ask him if he could maybe speak up and give his comments on the video so that we preserve them for history here.
Sure. I just the question a little bit about best advice that Russ gives to doctoral students, and so I just put in some of the best advice that I've gotten from Russ, some of it spoken and some of it unspoken. And so the first one is that good ideas are worth sticking with and seeing through. And so some of my ideas that were good ideas, but that I was never quite capable of doing on my own, Russ has just encouraged me over many, many, many years to help me develop those ideas and push them forward. And now, after many years, starting to see success with those ideas that I don't know that I would have had the confidence to do without that sort of persistent pushing from an advisor. And number two, being a good human is powerful and transformational. And I think this is, Russ is just a good human, and so I've seen that effect in my life, but also in the lives of the people that Russ is around. That just
I only turn human on a full moon, just to be clear.
False statement. And when I was getting ready to go on the job market, Russ's advice to me was have fun, and have fun. And I was stressed out and worried, and he just said, you'll never again have an opportunity when people will invest so much in your work. So just go and enjoy that. And put your best foot forward, put your work out there, and enjoy the opportunity to have great conversations with people. And that changed the way that I approached the job market. And it wasn't fun, but I was able to have fun in giving the talks and having great conversations with smart people who are investing in my research. I thought that was great advice. And then the last one, which is kind of tongue in cheek, is who's the audience again? Because I've heard that question more than any other question in my life. In talking to Russ about research ideas, but great advice.
See, it just goes to show sometimes you don't even know what the best advice is that you're giving. It takes the other side to hear what to identify what the best advice is sometimes. Thanks, DK. So I see here we have a question from Abby Mulik. Abby, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I think this question is really, in some ways, a follow-up to Jasmine's question. So I remember Henry Mintzberg often taking offense to the term capital in human capital. And I was just curious if you have any reflections on that.
Sure. So I've run into that, obviously, my background is largely in economics. My approach is largely coming from economics, but remember that even before that, my approach was from accounting, right? And so I use the term asset. Some people have, particularly on the sociology side, have taken issue with the term human asset or human capital as though it refers to slavery. To me, it highlights, again, coming from the the accounting perspective, where it's where actually people are literally an expense. And so being an asset is so much better than just being an expense, if you want to think of it that way. And the other thing that I would say is that the term asset highlights the boundary conditions on, I'm obviously not referring to ownership, but I am referring to control. And control highlights sort of the zone of indifference. What is the extent to which the organization can motivate people to act in a coordinated fashion to create value? And it's not that, and because they're not owned, it means that that you have to explore the extent to which you're able to gain cooperation from people. So I don't take in. I understand that for some people it's sort of a political issue that human capital and human asset bring to mind, ownership of people. Clearly, I don't mean that. But then it does highlight, so what are the limitations? How does it compare to other assets that organizations can have? And the alternative to asset, again, to me, is expense, and that's just way worse.
Thank you. I think Rich is still muted.
Sorry about that. I apologize. So Sushant has posted a question, another question. So let me ask Sushant to unmute and ask the question.
Yeah, thanks. I was just curious because I'm having difficulties matching my work with the scope of coverage of journals. So I wanted to know that when you talked about choosing an audience, do you mean editorial board members or people reading the journal or management practitioners? Please, your comments.
So the lowest level, or the most nuanced level that you've given, I think, is probably editorial board members, and that's probably the closest to what I would mean. What I would mean by audience is specific individuals. Identify 3 people who you would like to have as reviewers who are writing in that area, and what are their perspectives? What might they be offended by? What would they see your value added, your contribution? It's nice if those people happen to be editorial board members. That helps you. In fact, that tells you whether the journal is the right target, probably, for your work, if in fact the journal has those people as board members. Oftentimes I think that doctoral students don't recognize how nuanced the literature is. We happen to be in a very, very fragmented field. And that means that some things that we take for granted have sub-audiences that don't talk to each other or hate each other. And if you think that your audience is like the readers of a journal, that's not nearly nuanced enough. You have to be identifying. So to take the strategic human capital side of it, the dance that I virtually always have to address these days is that we have some people in the field who are coming at it from the strategy side, and we have some people in the field who are coming at it from the HR side, and they still use different language and are a little bit uncomfortable if you use the other side's language, and they'll kill the work if you get it to the wrong audience. So that's within the notion of strategic human capital. If you were thinking strategic human capital is one audience, what I'm saying is there are sub-audiences there, and to be successful, you really want to sort of aim at very specific sub-audiences to the extent that you can.
So it sounds like there's still a value for that translation table that you developed for the reviewers of your first paper.
There's a whole new set of terms.
Right.
So to give you an example, HR people often will use the term emergence to reflect the aggregation of value creation from the individual level human capital to an organization level resource. To me, coming more from the economics side, I use the term complementarity. The resources, not just human capital, but all the resources are working in concert in some sense to create value that's greater than their individual contributions. So I use one term. HR people are more likely to use the other term. I do my best not to kill their work if it comes to me and they use the term emergence.
Right.
But we use different terms.
So here's a suggestion for you that may alleviate this problem for future strategic HR researchers. You should write a paper which presents this translation between the two fields and talks about the subtleties of the translations in both directions, and then strategic human capital researchers in the future can simply refer to your paper to help their reviewers, whichever side they're on, to understand what they're trying to say.
By the way, we need that in lots of areas, right? Because we use different language and we talk across each other kind of all the time.
Right. I don't think it would be, I think it would be a very easy paper for you to write, and one that would be very well received and would have a lot of value and perhaps be impactful.
I give my PhD students an article, I'm going to get the author order wrong, Miller, Glick, and Cardinal, on what is academic life like in a field where that's highly fragmented. What does your audience look like? And they start, it's really a depressing article. I have to talk students off the ledge at the end of it, because it's like, you shouldn't have a family. If fairness is important to you, then this isn't the field for you. It gets really ugly. But the starting point is we have a fragmented paradigm in our field, and that is an important starting point.
So this idea seems to have gotten some traction in the chat window. Samina is saying, yes, start a petition to get Russ to do this. And but Andrew is asking if it wouldn't actually be an insult to people on both sides. Thank you, Gwen, for posting the link to that that article that Russ was referring to. So okay, other questions from the audience? We have a little time for other questions. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I see Tim has a question here. Tim, you want to chime in with your question?
Russ, I don't want to put you on the spot with this all-encompassing question, but some of the issues you've alluded to, you've taken on head-on is around human capital and how employees might appropriate value. And isn't it, if we're thinking about competitive advantage, shouldn't that be part of the equation? So that begs the question, how do we measure competitive advantage? As strategy research, this is an important issue, and it's gaining increasing importance with climate change and firms being asked to step up and take hits financially to attend to rather important matters.
Yep.
So feel free to punt on this one, but this is an important issue to me, and I just
it's really critical. It's really critical. So I guess first of all, I would because we are empirical researchers, we tend to focus on what's measurable, and it is not always the case. In fact, it is most of the time not the case that our theoretical constructs map nicely onto what our measures are. But we aren't always fully aware of that. So competitive advantage in theory is about economic value. It's not about accounting value. It's not about accounting profits. It's about economic value. And what does that mean? Well, to understand economic value, we have to have measures of all the opportunity costs of all the resources to understand how value are they being deployed in the most to create the most economic value. We'll never have those kinds of measures. So I guess a starting point would be, well, let's understand where our theory and our measures are not aligned. One of the things that I struggle with, and this gets at some of the definitional issues, we use the term firm, and then we use the term organization. And I'll tell you how I like to use those terms. For me, a firm is a legal entity that's defined by ownership of assets. And it's very specific, and some theoretical questions are very much oriented around the ownership of assets. That's the most critical question. When we talk about make versus buy, we want to know, are we bringing, a function inside of the ownership boundaries of the firm, if you will, and that's about a firm. Most of the literature on competitive advantage actually is not about the ownership boundaries of the firm. It is about the cooperation and coordination that needs to occur to create value. In other words, most of our theorizing, in my thinking, is about organizations, where the boundary is not about whether we own the assets. The boundary is about whether we're able to achieve cooperation. So we have literatures on sort of strategic alliances as a critical source of competitive advantage. Well, in order for us even to broach that topic, we have to acknowledge that the unit of analysis for competitive advantage might not be the legal boundaries of the firm. It might be cooperation and coordination. So we don't use those terms with that specificity in the literature, and I think most of the time we don't understand and think about the distinctions between these terms. But most of our theorizing is about cooperation and coordination. And I think if that focuses us a little bit on, well, how do we achieve cooperation and coordination? When does it exist? When does it not exist? We can't measure performance until we sort of understand what we're talking about performance of. Mm-hmm. And in my thinking, most of the theory is about organization, and then it's about economic value. And now hopefully you're seeing how distant profit of a legal entity, a firm, might be from economic value created by an organization that might span the legal boundaries of the firm. What I'm doing is creating a whole bunch of problems. and I do that well, I create problems. But I think what I want to convey is that the fact that there are these problems, there are also opportunities. It means that each of these things are opportunities for people to explore.
So when I saw Tim's question in the chat window, it first of all, it was phrased a little bit more pointedly than the way he phrased it when he asked it to you. He said, in your opinion, what should be the objective of the firm? And I thought, okay, if I'm Russ Koff, how am I going to answer that? So I put on my little Russ Koff hat, and I was making notes in my mind. I was thinking, and I think I didn't come too far away from your answer. I was thinking that Russ would say, well, the firm is a nexus of contracts. So why should we expect something as disembodied as a nexus of contracts to have an objective? Am I in the right neighborhood? Should we even think of firms as having an objective if they're just a disembodied nexus of contracts?
So, I mean, it's likely to have multiple objectives. Thanks for bringing that back, because I think that was embedded in Tim's question, that there might be objectives beyond economic value. And for sure, that's the case. And embedded in that question, and the nexus is a way to look at it, a nexus of stakeholders, if you will. That really does mean that the notion that the firm has, a firm or organization has a single unified objective doesn't make a lot of sense. That's certainly true.
Okay. Okay, Jing, you have a question you want to ask Russ? You can unmute and do it.
Oh yeah. Hi, professors. My question may be too young, too naive. So what is your opinion on the relationship between market and hierarchy? in terms of, especially in terms of the organization of assets, such as the human capital assets. So is there some possible explanation around this? So the boundary of the organization is actually determined by the value created by the synergists grouping together certain human capital, because the value can be larger than the value created by those individual persons in the market. Yeah, I want your opinion. And also hierarchy is just the way to manage or organize those kind of capital or assets, right? Yeah, so I want your opinion on this. Yeah, thank you.
I'll do my best there. So I guess I'll rely a little bit on my work with Rich, where we explored hybrid organizations there. And you know, yeah, he's happy, I know.
Yay! Yay!
You know, we much of the transaction cost economics literature, certainly not all of it, but much of it has looked at markets and hierarchies as you know, it's one or the other, and in most cases there's nuance where you have hierarchies that have market-like aspects within them, and then you have markets that have hierarchical aspects within them in terms of how authority and whatnot is laid out. So, you know, you can, my work with Rich, we have this this cube that you can look at that paper, the both market and hierarchy. I think it's in the chat already. Where we look at 3 dimensions that Holmstrom and Milgram brought out, but they're brought out in the literature, and the dimensions of, you know, defining markets and hierarchy are, you know, who has authority to make decisions, how strong are the productivity incentives, and who owns the underlying assets. So if we take these 3 dimensions, you know, we can acknowledge that it has a lot to do with how we're organizing the people, who is in charge. And when we talk about these hybrid organizations, so you can outsource something and retain, you know, full control. Like you could be, you know, we have, you know, you could retain full control, like you outsource something, and you're directing your outsourced staff, temporary staff, if you will, as though they were employees. And that has actually created some problems with the IRS, that it often works that way. And so you're bringing the market inside in some sense, because they're not your employees, but they kind of are. They're behaving as your employees. Or you can have outside suppliers that are investing so heavily in your routines within your organization and investing in firm-specific human capital to the point where you know, you've taken your hierarchy and moved it beyond the organizational boundaries, and it's external. So you know, I guess what I want to convey is the fuzziness of those boundaries when we think of markets and hierarchies, and to push people to think about the nuance of what's going on. Yes, you're organizing human capital, but the clarity of it being either market or hierarchy is a lot less clear than we maybe have been thinking of it as. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. So I have a follow-up question. Based on the synergies can be created by grouping people together. So the value is embedded in the relationship of all those persons, or embedded in personal assets. I also want your opinion on this question. Where is the value embedded? Thank you.
I guess my answer is yes. I mean, there's one of the problems with the term human capital is that it focuses on, it separates human capital from social capital, and there is no question that relational capital, social capital is a critical component, and in no way would I sort of minimize that. So clearly that's a piece of the picture. Understanding who to go to for knowledge or how to work with somebody is absolutely critical. And and it also is important to understand the complementarities between the knowledge and expertise that individuals have itself. So clearly both of these things are going on, and both of these have potential to create tremendous value. I hope that's where you were going with it. I think that's where you were going with it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jane. So we have about 8 minutes left, and out of respect for the traditions of the Meet the Scholar series, I will move to the lightning round questions that are more lighthearted and amusing than detailed intellectual questions about strategic human capital. So what's your favorite place that you've ever visited or traveled to?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. I guess I would say that since I recently had a sabbatical, I would say that my home away from home is Milan at Bocconi. Miss those folks. Enjoyed my colleagues there, enjoyed my time there, would love to go back sometime soon.
Great. And if you could have dinner and conversation with one deceased person from the historical past, who would it be?
Ooh, that's tough. I'll say Herb Simon.
Okay.
He's probably all of our ancestor.
And what kind of conversation would you have with him? What would you ask, or what would you talk about?
Help me understand my audience.
I think DK is smiling at that one. Okay. And
I'd love to hear what he'd have to say with how and where the literature has gone and how it's built on his work, because there's just no way, I don't think, that he could have anticipated the multiple directions that it's gone, and that would be cool.
Another lightning round question is, what do you do to relax or unwind? Do you have any hobbies or anything like that?
So I have, for years, I meditate with my guitar. You will not hear me play it, but fortunately for you. But when I need to take a break from writing, and I hit blocks like everybody else, I guess my new obsession is we got a puppy a month ago. And so that has been great fun for us. Little Kelev.
So speaking of animals, one of the questions that Samina fed me for the lightning round is, if you could be an animal, what animal would you be and why?
Oh, that's easy. My spirit animal is a sloth.
And why?
Because I can be very lazy.
And then I think this is maybe the last question here. If you were stranded on an island, with all of your basic needs met, like food, water, shelter, etc., what non-essential item would you bring along to have with you?
I'd probably need music.
Okay, good. Well, I am out of questions. If anybody else has a last question, we have 4 minutes left. We can maybe try to squeeze in one more question. Just unmute and speak up if you do. Be brave. Oh, gee whiz. Okay, yeah, I see some coming into the chat window here. Okay, yeah, sure. Let's go with DK's question. What question would Les want us to ask that would embarrass you? Leslie is his wife, of course.
Wow. That's a tough one. I'm not sure what she would. It's true, she might like to see me embarrassed.
Maybe something about the fire.
I don't know.
Okay.
I think she's glad that you don't see how I really am, because then she would be embarrassed.
And Samina is asking now, what's your worst habit?
My worst habit.
Maybe other than laziness. You already admitted to laziness, right? So.
It has been pointed out to me that my personal style has flaws.
See, I think the worst habit is excessive overuse of Dilbert cartoons. That's probably my.
It could be, although I've kind of moved on to video. So.
Oh, okay. Well, good. I'm glad that problem has solved itself then. Good. Well,
so we've I guess I do want to say, so we've you put in a plug for the Carpenter Toolbox.
Yes, please do.
I want to say that the pandemic has pushed me, and I'm sure all of you, to sort of figure out some things in teaching that, so I got dragged kicking and screaming into, online, because I'm very focused on experiential stuff, probably way more than most of you. And this pushed me to realize some opportunities, and I've tried to, add some things into the toolbox that are focused on online teaching. So do check that out.
And that's carpenterstrategytoolbox.com, I think, right? .com.
Yep.
And,
named for Mason Carpenter, who was my colleague who brought me to Madison in the first place.
Right. And he had started it, and you took it over?
He had been posting some tools, and he would not have named it after himself.
Okay.
I'll just say that.
Well, yeah, and he's worth honoring. He was a great contributor to our field and sorely missed. And so yeah, so that's a toolbox that I refer to frequently, and I refer doctoral students to it as well. It's a great resource to the field, and thank you for building up that and developing that institution.
So I want to offer a hat tip to our colleagues in STR, but also my colleagues in SMS, and actually in all of our organizations. I think people have risen to the occasion to create value for the field in this pandemic, that in a way that I think has been awesome. Obviously, I have invested a lot in service to the field. I don't want you to think that was altruistic. I'm selfish. I've gotten to work with some wonderful people that way. I would encourage others to do that, because you really do get to work with wonderful people who care about the field. So get involved is part of a message that I would have to you. There are opportunities to do so.
Yep, and thanks again to Zhao, Gwen, Tim, and Samina, and the rest of the STR team for giving us this opportunity to have the sequel to our conversation that we had last month. And I really appreciate that. And it's been an honor and a privilege to serve as your moderator today, and to get the opportunity to interview my good friend, Russ Koff. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you all.